Hello, everybody. So, l'chaim, l'chaim. I know the class tonight is starting about 45 minutes late. We had a Tu B'Shvat Seder tonight. That was very, very beautiful. That a few communities joined together. The Westwood Kehillah, the Rose Avenue Shul, the Moshav, the Happy Minyan, and the Chai Center. So together we all had a Tu B'Shvat Seder, and Sina's saying she's already drunk. I actually am also. And you know why I didn't mind drinking at the Tu B'Shvat Seder before teaching tonight? Because I was watching a video of the Rebbe. There are video clips of the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was doing a giving out dollars, and there was a group of girls that came on, and they said they brought their school with them from Chicago, I think it was, and the Rebbe called the teacher back, and the Rebbe said, "Don't forget to farbrang on Tu B'Shvat with the girls." So, ladies and gentlemen, whoever is here, tonight is not only going to be a Torah learning, but it's going to be a farbrangen. So we're going to start with the Parsha of the week, Beshallach, and we're going to end with Tu B'Shvat. I might go on all night. We had a beautiful Tu B'Shvat Seder. It started at 7, and it was just over. And thank you, Adrian. I love this Seder also. I got to drink a lot of white wine and red wine and in my Sheva Chaya glass. So if Sheva Chaya comes on tonight, everybody can vouch that I'm drinking the last of my wine in the Sheva Chaya glass. So l'chaim, that we should all really merit that, first of all, whoever needs a complete healing during this time should have a complete healing, that the world should be freed of this plague, and that we should really go on to live in our holy land together and to be able to serve Hashem with joy and unity of heart and simcha. So l'chaim. I want to dedicate tonight to my dear friend Mimi, her father's yortzeit, Moshe Raphael ben Yitzhak Yosef. His soul should have the highest of aliyahs. I see Yerushalayim is on, so we can start. Okay, so the Parsha is Beshallach, and it says the Jews left Egypt. So the Exodus happened, all the plagues happened. The Jews left Egypt, and they approached the shores of the Red Sea, and the Pharaoh was chasing after them. Pharaoh and his merry pranksters were chasing after him. And Moshe reassured the Jews, and he said, "Do not fear, stand firm, and see the salvation that God will bring you today. And though you see the Egyptians today, you will never see them again. God will fight for you, and you will remain silent." So it says that Jews were standing at the edge of the Red Sea, and they were terrified by the advancing Egyptians, and they broke into 4 camps, and each advocated a different course of action. Hello, Nomi from Yerushalayim also. So the first camp said, "Let us plunge into the sea," meaning rather than return to slavery, let's drown. We don't want to go back that way. And the second camp said, "Let us return to Egypt." They were willing to accept the bondage of slavery again. The third camp said, "Let us wage war against them," hoping that they would be victorious. And the fourth camp said, "Let us cry out to God." Rather, they wanted to cry out to God in prayer that should be enough. So Moshe's statement that he made was a response to each of these 4 camps. Stand firm and see the salvation that God will bring about was addressed to those who wish to throw themselves into the sea. And you shall remain silent was addressed to those who advocated prayer. Though you see the Egyptians today, you will never see them again was addressed to those who sought to return to Egypt. God will fight for you was addressed to those who advocated war. So God said to Moses, "Speak to the children of Israel and have them journey forth. Proceeding further, meaning they were let out of Egypt to serve God on the mountain, and that's where they needed to go. And this was the goal, to arrive at Mount Sinai. That was the goal of the whole Exodus. So how was it possible for Moshe to answer all four camps at once? Even because their positions seemed diametrically opposed to each other. For example, the suggestion to return to Egypt was an antithesis of drowning in the sea, because those who were willing to drown in the sea were willing to advocate that for spiritual suicide, and that was forbidden. Suicide is forbidden. It always was forbidden. Even though there are some mitzvahs that weren't compelled on people before the Torah. Stephanie, I'm laughing. I love after parties. Okay, l'chaim to the after party, Stephanie. L'chaim to the after party. Okay, so they couldn't have gone in as an act of suicide because it was forbidden. But they didn't want to submit to the Egyptians again. And it says that they advocated war because they didn't want to submit to slavery. And they were willing to take up arms against their former masters. And they actually thought they could be victorious against these very powerful Egyptians. So also, by only turning to prayer, they were willing to go to an act of submissiveness. Just pray, just stand there and pray and hope something will change. So it says that the core of the mitzvah of prayer is to pray for what you need. But this is a mitzvah of great importance, and it expresses our faith in God and in God's omnipotence. So there are certain opinions which consider this a mitzvah of general importance, so encompassing that it is not even called one of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. So in the sum, when the counting of the 613 mitzvahs was done, that be holy was not included. It was just so generally understood that we have to be holy that it wasn't even counted as one of the mitzvahs. The confrontation at the sea took place before the giving of the Torah and before prayer was actually considered a mitzvah. It says Abraham was commanded concerning circumcision, and also he instituted the morning prayer. So he was given certain commandments that he was to fulfill and that he did fulfill. Let's go back. It says that a lofty mitzvah that was after the giving of the Torah indicates that it was also important before the Torah was given. So there are it says that our matriarchs and patriarchs internally kept the mitzvahs. Internally, they understood what the mitzvahs were. And if it was something important to be considered after the Torah, we can see that it was also kept before the Torah was given. So there were, in these four different camps of people standing there being afraid at the pursuit of the Egyptians, there were four different opinions, four different possibilities, four different decisions. How could they all have been answered by one statement from Moshe? Also, we want to understand the order in which the Torah mentions the rebuttals to each of the four different camps. It says that you would assume that the Torah would rebuke the least important, the least developed of the approaches first, the willingness to return to Egypt, and then the increasingly more developed approaches, including the suicide in the ocean and waging war against the Egyptians and the prayer. It says, were all these approaches wrong? It was necessary to negate the desire to return to Egypt, because that was the opposite of God's will God's intent in the Exodus. In the Exodus, God took everybody out of Egypt, not for them to decide to return to Egypt. Casting oneself into the sea was undesirable, for a Jew should never fall into despair. And the notion of doing battle appears to be constructive, because the Jews did leave Egypt armed. They did leave prepared to battle. And praying to God, giving oneself over to God, is certainly valuable. It's never lost on us, a time of prayer. And it even reflects a seemingly deeper commitment than journeying forth, because journeying forth, setting out from Egypt, could be considered as fleeing from the Egyptians, while prayer does represent our turning to God in reliance. So let's come to understand these different things. So we have to deepen our appreciation, and here is the key factor that is going to give us an insight into what happened during that time and how it relates to us today, because everything that we are learning in Torah today must relate to us in the now. So the splitting of the sea was the final stage of the exodus from Egypt, and until then, the Jews shared a connection with Egypt. It says, even when the Jews passed what was called the mouth of freedom, which according to the Egyptian custom was a landmark indicating that a slave had been freed. If they had come to a certain point, that slave was freed. They were still pursued, and it seemed by only defeating and fighting their Egyptian masters could they preserve their freedom. So it says that Pharaoh took 30 Egyptians with him when he went after the Jews, 30 Egyptians for every Jew. So that meant every Jew would have to fight 30 Egyptians. And yet the Jews were willing to engage in a full-scale war. Also, we learn that when was the exodus from Egypt completed? At the splitting of the Red Sea. So the splitting of the sea marked the consummation of the task of refining the godly sparks that were enclosed within Egypt's material substance. What is that represented by? Remember, during the plague of darkness, it said the Jews were able to see where the wealth of the Egyptians were hidden. And when they left Egypt, they asked for that wealth, and they took that wealth with them. So it's explained in our sage's statement that the plunder the Jews gathered after the drowning of the Egyptians, because remember, the Egyptians chased after the Jews, and they went into the sea after them, and they were drowned. And it says that the plunder that they gained after the drowning, that was greater than what they took out of Egypt, because they adorned their chariots with jewels and other precious items, and this is what the Jews were able to take out of the sea when the Egyptians were drowned. And it says, even the plunder which the Jews took out of Egypt became theirs only after the splitting of the sea, because originally they borrowed from their Egyptian neighbors. Can I borrow this? Can I borrow that? But when they were killed, when they pursued them in the sea, then the property became their own. Also, the relation of the splitting of the sea to the exodus from Egypt is also reflected in the concept that the splitting of the sea was a necessary preparation for the giving of the Torah, which was the whole purpose from the exodus of Egypt. We have to remember that let my people go to serve me. People only remember like one half of the sentence. It's always convenient just to remember one half of the sentence. But the whole thing was, let my people go in order to serve me. So l'chaim for Stella Eliezri, l'chaim for your birthday. Okay, so let's continue. So when was the exodus from Egypt complete? At the splitting of the Red Sea. And we are supposed to mention this miracle every day, just like we mention the going out of the Exodus from Egypt every day. Because until we were at the splitting of the sea, we were not free of Egypt. And it says that these historical events are paralleled by the stages within our divine service. Each day, there are stages in our divine service that correspond to the exodus from Egypt and others that correspond to the splitting of the sea. And that is really what we need to forbrang on. We need to forbrang on how these things happen and how they affect our life today, 2021. I always want to say 1964 for some reason. That must have been a momentous year, but it's actually now 2021. And it says that the fact that the splitting of the sea came after the negation of the 4 approaches, the 4 different camps we just talked about, and the fulfillment of the commandment that God gave to journey forth. This is all relevant to us today. And it says that we experience the counterpart of the Exodus in each and every generation and each and every day. Because in order to leave Egypt, we have to journey forth. We have to have a goal to leave something behind. We have to know where we're going. And in choosing to join any of the 4 camps that we spoke about before, one was settling for less than complete departure from spiritual exile. So we were in this exile, and we had our eye on a goal, and the goal was to get to Mount Sinai. It says, with regard to the spiritual counterpart of the exodus from Egypt, we must experience the departure from Egypt and then the splitting of the Red Sea. First, we have to leave the boundaries and the limitations of the animal soul. So we know that every Jew, and we've spoken about it before in this class, that every Jew has a godly soul and an animal soul. And the animal soul is limiting, but the animal soul is the vitality and the life force and the energy and the pushing forward to get to that mountain. And it says, each of us lives in this material world, which is a world of klipa. And what do we see in this world? We see the wicked prospering. We see that happening before our eyes. And it says we all have to know that evil has no dominion over us. And we have to believe it. And that we are not controlled by Pharaoh, that we serve God alone. And I think we have to say l'chaim on that, l'chaim for the Farbrengen, that we have to understand that that's who we serve. We serve God alone. And we know from the Alter Rebbe that he says, live with the times, live with the Torah teaching of the week. And the Torah teaching of the week is telling us we have to go out of Egypt and we have to be present at the splitting of the sea. The animal soul contains within it the Yetzer Hara, the, quote, evil inclination, which are the counterparts of Pharaoh and Egypt. And they strive to limit the powers of the godly soul, and they try to drain the satisfaction that we get from learning Torah and from observing mitzvahs. But a Jew can proceed with this level of what we've learned before, which is Kabbalah's ol, which is wearing the yoke of heaven, going in that direction straight forward without going to the right and without going to left, that God is directing us to go in. And we are committed to serving God, not to serving Pharaoh, but to serving God in every aspect of our life. And this is what will take us out of Egypt. And this is what will bring us to what we call the mouth of freedom. The exodus from Egypt does not represent the consummation of the process. Because why? Because Pharaoh chased after them. He chased after them with 30 warriors against every Jew. And he attempted to subjugate those Jews again to slavery. And it says that the constraints and limitations of our own animal soul and the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and the concealment of godliness that is brought about by the world conspire to limit and conceal the light of the godly soul. So we are limited and how we can react in the world and in what we see. And it is necessary for our personal divine service to reach a point, just like it reached at the splitting of the sea, of which it is said that he transformed the sea into dry land. This is an analogy. Just as the sea covers the seabed, what is the sea? The sea refers to divine power that is concealed within creation. Dry land refers to the revelation of this potential, that a person, through their divine service, can appreciate the godliness that is within everything. We have an ability to do that. We actually can appreciate the godliness that is within everything. And this is what will take us out of Egypt, because the world then will not conceal the godly light. Instead, we will see godliness in everything. I mean, I just think that's a wow statement, that we will have the ability, and we do have the ability, to see godliness in everything. And we have to remind ourselves of that at almost every moment. And that is why we have to remember the going out of Egypt every single day. And it says, to go back to what we learned in the beginning of this lesson, that the attitudes of all four camps were expressed after the beginning of the Exodus. So it says that a Jew that is motivated by an approach which contradicts the way a Jew should live, the code of Jewish law, has not left Egypt at all. And it says that if a person will go back to one of the four camps that we talked about in the beginning, of waging war, of going back to slavery, of running away, of turning in prayer, then the person has not yet crossed the Red Sea. They have not gone across the splitting of the sea. And it says that the concealment of godliness in the world still affects them. They don't see godliness. We don't see godliness. And therefore our actions follow in a different light. And Pharaoh and his hosts call to us when we don't see godliness, and push us to take one of the four ways that were represented by one of the four opposing camps. And in order to bring about the splitting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptians and overcoming the final limitations and restraints of exile, it is necessary to negate these approaches. And I just want to say one thing, that it says that when the Egyptians drowned in the Red Sea, when they attempted to cross after the Jews, and the Jews were celebrating, God wasn't. God said, "These are my creations. I can't celebrate the death of my creations." That there is always the opportunity for tshuva. There was always the opportunity for change that they did not take. So the four camps are mentioned in ascending order. The easiest approach is to plunge into the sea, because we live in a world where Pharaoh can be victorious. And if we don't want to have anything to do with that kind of oppression and that kind of slavery, we may opt to plunge into the sea. What is plunge into the sea? Is to see the purification in the sea of Torah, prayer, and tshuva, like just to go fully in that direction. And then what about the world? What happens to the world? What happens to one's fellow Jews? What about taking some action to end Pharaoh's rule over the world? It says the plunger doesn't want to face these questions. Let somebody else deal with these matters. Why should I worry about God's hidden things? These are God's problems that I want to worry about myself. I don't want to worry about the world. So we need, one of the things that the Rebbe is emphasizing here so much is that is not our approach. There's a Hasidic story that was told that there was a rabbi of a community, and he was gathering money to purchase wood for the poor women and widows and orphans of the community that didn't have for the winter. And he went to the home of a very rich man, and he asked him, he said he wanted to talk to him, and the rich man greeted him very, very nicely and said, "Please, Rabbi, come sit down." And he says, "No, I need to talk to you outside." And he says, "Why? The fire is so warm. Come sit by the fire." And he says, "No, I absolutely need to talk to you outside." So he comes outside, and the man is saying, "What do you want? What is it?" And the rabbi starts to tell him the long story about the widows and the orphans and how they're going to go cold in the winter. And he says, "Yes, Rabbi, anything. I'll give you anything you want, any sum you want. Can we go in now?" And the rabbi said yes. And afterwards, the man said to him, Why couldn't you ask me for the money for the wood inside? Why did you have to ask me outside?" And the rabbi said to him, "If I asked you inside where you were warm, sitting by your fire, you wouldn't have felt the cold and the necessity to warm up other people." And that's what we're saying here. We're saying that we need to understand the necessity to warm up the world, to not just rely on what is good for us. And it says some Jews would rather plunge into the sea, cut themselves off from the world at large. So that person, what do we refer to them as? A tzaddik in pelts, meaning a tzaddik, a righteous person, quote unquote, who wraps themselves in a heavy winter coat to protect themselves against the world's bitter winds, reasoning that he can only protect himself. He only has one coat. He can't warm up the entire planet. But he concedes that he could share his coat, and he could warm up another Jew, perhaps another 2 Jews, maybe the corner of his world, but he's not interested in that. That his pride will not let him be involved with such limited matters. So he retreats. He doesn't do anything. And it says there was a more developed approach to divine service, and that was displayed by the camp of those who desired to return to Egypt. These people knew that God did not, these people thought that God did not create the world to be a wasteland, but rather to be a settled environment. And it says that we are commanded to involve ourselves in the world. And whether we want to or we don't want to, we must live in the world, in the body and in the animal soul, for that is what God wants. So it says that type of person, when they are given an instruction to perform a good deed, yes, they will do that good deed, but it will be harsh labor for them, meaning they'll do it without life force or without feeling. They will not seek to have an illumination, a shining with that mitzvah. They do only what is necessary to fulfill the instructions they were given. And such a person can be haunted by despair. They don't feel capable of doing anything, not in the world or not in themselves. And they are willing to go back to Egypt and to be a slave in the material world. And it says that this is what's called harsh labor. When the sun rises, that person davens. When the time comes for the prayers in the afternoon, the person prays. They eat. They make a blessing before and they make a blessing after. And if they meet another Jew who needs a favor, they will do that favor, but it's all done with a sigh. When someone tells him that there's a Jew nearby that needs help with material or spiritual matters, that person realizes, love your fellow as yourself. They're obligated to help, and they offer assistance, but there's not that desire to help. There's not that satisfaction in helping. It's just another dreary task, another part of the hard labor the person must perform. They have lost all hope. They don't see any future. And this approach to divine service is inadequate. That we have to proceed in our service of God with vitality and with joy. And if you are not feeling the vitality and joy, then one is obligated to find a mashpia, a spiritual guidance counselor or a spiritual guidance friend or person who can lead you to that place of feeling the vitality and the joy in doing the mitzvah. Because when we commit and when we study Torah, there's a connection between ourself and God. And that connection should lead to that vitality and energy. And it should be evident that we are permeated by joy. This is, I just have to say l'chaim to joy. Why not? That we have to find that place of joy in every single thing we do. You know, I have a handicapped daughter. Her name is Hanala. And she really personifies taking joy in everything. She loves to say the brachas. It doesn't matter if it's the holiday or if it's not the holiday. There are certain brachas that she loves to say. She loves to say the Hanukkah brachas. She loves to sing the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur songs. And for her, she's present in those places at those moments. And it says that we can be present in different mitzvahs, and we can understand that we're carrying them on with joy and vitality. And we should feel that with every word of Torah we study and with every mitzvah we observe, that it affects the entire world. Every mitzvah reduces the influence of Egypt in the world. I love that. Again, I'm going to say it. Every mitzvah we do reduces the influence of Egypt in the world. You know, the Lubavitcher Rebbe instituted 10 mitzvah campaigns. My husband used to call them the 10 suggestions: to light Shabbos candles, for men to put on tefillin, to have kosher mezuzahs in your house, to have a charity box in your house, and to keep charity every day except Shabbos and holidays, to eat kosher food, to have holy books for married couples to use the mikvah, to educate yourself. There are 2 more. Somebody will remind me to give tzedakah every day, to fill in, mikvah, kosher. So all of that was to reduce the influence of Egypt in the world. When you put those things together, one opposite the other, it's mind-blowing on many, many levels. But when a Jew is not possessed by this awareness and is overcome by despair regarding the Torah and mitzvahs as a burden which they have to drag around day after day without happiness, without vitality, that means they're carrying out what's called the, quote, harsh labor of Egypt. At a higher rung is the decision to wage war against the world. One is unable to bear the concealment of godliness that is brought about by Pharaoh. Okay, Phyllis has won the free Shabbos dinner, which is put your kids and yourself in a Jewish education and to keep kosher, to keep some level of kosher. Thank you. So it says that to wage war is a more developed level because the warrior is not in despair. They feel the forces of holiness can overcome the forces of unholiness, and they carry out their divine service with relentless energy. But even in a war, even the winner in a war suffers losses. It's not a perfect solution. And there's another drawback. Every phase of divine service has an appropriate time. When God is telling the Jews to serve me on this mountain, that's what you're supposed to be doing. You're not supposed to be baking challah in the oven. You're supposed to be serving God in this mountain. You're supposed to be going forth to that commandment. We have to be focused on journeying forth and coming closer and closer to receiving the Torah. The question arises, what is the source for the warrior's desire to fight? Did he ask God or Moshe if this is the appropriate form of divine service at this time? No, that person declares war on his own. It's based on his own or her own intellect. So it's possible that this desire to engage in battle comes from outside the realm of holiness. Perhaps the person's nature is one of Gevurah, of one of strength, of one of warring, and therefore they're bent on war. So it says that there's a side thought here, and it says, with regard to trying to influence another through love, the Alter Rebbe writes that even if one doesn't succeed, there still is the reward of brotherly love, but there is no such reward when you declare a personal war. So that when you try to love your fellow Jew, there's a reward in even the trying, even without succeeding. It says the highest of the four approaches manifested before the splitting of the sea was the urge to pray. So what is prayer? Prayer means developing a connection with God, and the person is committed to carrying out God's will. He does not desire to plunge into the sea by taking care of his own personal spiritual development and cutting off himself or herself from the world. For she realizes that God wants the world to become a dwelling place for godliness. That's what God wants. And there is no desire to return to Egypt because the person doesn't have despair. They have no doubts because they know that godliness will prevail. And thus the person does not seek to wage war against them by using their own strategies and initiative. They are connected to God, they subordinate their will to God, and they have no personal desires. Their desire is to do the will of God. And it says the path of divine service is not to change the natural order of the world, instead, to give ourselves over to God entirely, praying God will enable us to achieve everything that we need to achieve and accomplish in the world, and to fill our requests and to elevate the world. So it says prayer can be lacking. We need work and initiative also. We can't just lay back and just pray. We need to go forward, we need to work, and we need initiative in the work. So a Jew is commanded to rise above their personal self, that nothing one accomplishes is by their own strength and the power of their own hands. It is only by God's hand that he gives us to prosper. And it says, however, this reliance on God should not take from us the initiative and our urge to achieve. We have to work within the potential of what God has given. Just as God fuses opposites, so too a Jew's divine service can combine opposite thrusts, meaning that we know it is God who achieves everything, and yet we work within our own power to be able to be successful. So we can look at it in terms of livelihood. On one hand, we need to know that everything is granted to us by God. All things come from God, and whatever we receive must be for our ultimate good, even if to our physical eye it doesn't appear good. A Jew must manifest what we call bitachon, perfect trust, believing without any doubt that we will receive good that can be recognized as good. So it says bitachon does not mean trusting that God will provide circumstances which we attribute as good. It means trusting that God will provide us with good that we can appreciate as good, even with our limited human understanding. So it says that we must have such faith, even when, according to natural circumstances, there is no rationale for it. So it goes on to say, this is a text taken from the Frierdiker, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. And this is very deep, so we're going to say it slowly. Perfect trust in God means trusting even when there is no apparent source from which one's assistance can come. It says that there's a common expression when a person is sinking into the sea, God forbid, the person will grab a straw to try to save themselves. As long as there is a straw to grab onto, there is a shadow of an expectation of salvation within the material world. There is hope, tikva in Hebrew. And it says that, going back to Yoshua, the book of Yoshua, the thread of scarlet cord, meaning the tikvas, the hope of scarlet cord. So what was the scarlet cord? The scarlet cord was the sign given by Rachav. Rachav was, to shorten the teaching, Rachav was a prostitute. She was a woman who was able to save Yoshua and his men. The sign that she used to protect them was that there was a scarlet cord that was put out, and this was a sign that for the Jewish soldiers to save the members of their household, and it was called a thread of scarlet cord. And why this name? It says on the one hand, the sign was visible, but it was subject to different hazards, meaning the thread could snap, it could be blown away, or something can happen. However, there was always the tikva, the hope that everything would be well and the scarlet cord would remain in place, and it would be a sign that this is a place of refuge for those that had entered into the city of Jericho and were trying to conquer it. For the word hope refers to a redeeming factor within this world, even if it's as unlikely as a chance as a straw clutched by a drowning person would save them. Bitachon, trust, applies in a situation where there is not even a shadow of hope for the person to be saved, not even a straw to grasp onto, and still that person trusts in God. And there are so many stories of that. And even when a person trusts in God, but their soul is bitter and they are depressed, and their countenance has experienced grief, that it says when a person trusts in God with complete bitachon, even when their situation is not good, it does not affect their heart, nor does it cost them to cause them sorrow or gloom. They do everything according to God's and Torah's guidelines and the guidelines of human wisdom, and they trust in God, and they have no shadow of doubt that God will help them, for God's providence encompasses every single creation. Because everything is controlled by divine providence that grants life and power to every living being in the world. When a person is forced to confront suffering, they should accept it with happiness. So there's a story, I might have told it before, that the story is that there was a Rosh Yeshiva who was the head of a very big yeshiva, and he was a very wealthy man, and he was able to run his yeshiva from the profits from all his business dealings. And he taught his students that a person needs to dance for joy for bad news as well as good news, because everything comes from the hand of God. And that if there is going to be suffering in one's life, one needs to accept it with happiness, with perfect faith that it is for the person's ultimate good. So he was teaching that you have to dance for bad news as well as good news. And then he went to take a nap. And the news arrived to the yeshiva that he was a very wealthy man in logging, in forestry, in log shipping. And a telegram had arrived to the yeshiva that day that all the boats had sunk and he was now left a pauper. So one of the students said, how are we going to tell our Rebbe? We're going to wake him up. And they woke him up and they said, Rebbe, remember how you told us that you need to dance for bad news as well as good news? And he said, yes, of course. And they said to him, start dancing. And he fainted. And when he woke up, they said, why did you faint? And he said, then when I'm saying it theoretically, then it's a theory. You need to dance for bad news as well as good news. But when it happens to me, then that's a different story. So it goes on to say, when suffering has not come yet, even though there seems to be no natural way of avoiding it, one must have perfect faith that God will bring the person overt good and remove the threat. So we're asked to have perfect faith. We're asked to trust in that. And we ask both things from a Jew, because a Jew is connected with God, and God can reconcile opposites. And it does not contradict, and it is one of the foundations of faith. We know that everything is in the hands of heaven, even the fear of heaven. And it says that we can do nothing alone. We need God's help and support. We trust in God, and this trust and initiative stem from the godly soul. And what is the godly soul? It is an actual part of God. And it says that each opposite thrust complements each other. So to continue, the command that God gave to Moses was speak to the children of Israel and have them journey forth. So our divine service must involve drawing closer to Mount Sinai and not joining one of those 4 camps that we spoke about in the beginning of this lesson. Not withdrawing from worldly involvement, not performing our divine service in misery and despair, not abandoning our mission, but instead waging war against the world and not merely lifting up one's hands and depending solely on God. We have to make the effort. We have to make the vessel. We have to make the vehicle. We have to be involved in illuminating the world and bringing it closer to Torah. And it says this approach, which is going forward, journeying forward to reach Mount Sinai, brings about the splitting of the sea and the transformation of water into dry land. I just want to at this point say L'chaim Koshevachaya. I have your cup. And we're having a Farbrengen for Tu B'Shvat and for the Parsha. And this is my 4th cup in the Kabbalistic Sfat Seder tonight. I'm still on my 4th cup. So here we go. L'chaim from Shevachaya, my holy sister from Sfat. This beautiful cup can be yours. I'm sure it's shevachaya.com, something like that. L'chaim. So what is implied? It says that we have to split the sea and we have to transform the water into dry land. It says that the material dimensions of worldly existence should remain, but the godly power that is contained within them should be revealed. And it leads to the giving of the Torah. And it goes on to say in this footnote that God transformed the sea to dry land. It does not say he made dry land amidst the sea. Okay, I'm repeating. L'chaim Jodi. that he transformed the sea to dry land. So it says that the revelation of the splitting of the sea was not accomplished by the efforts of any of the four camps of dissension that we've been talking about. They all represent something that does not include the transformation of sea to dry land. Casting oneself into the sea represents separation from the world rather than transformation. Returning to Egypt is not transformation. Waging war is not transformation. And even prayer is not transformation. It says only journeying forth, only going towards the destination where God told us to go, to Mount Sinai, illuminates the world through the light of Torah and mitzvahs and brings about the transformation of the sea into dry land, which reveals God's active power in the world. To journey forth. It says when a Jew obtains a particular spiritual objective within their own personality, there is a parallel effect that comes into the world. So journeying forth involves not only a higher level of divine service than the four camps we've been talking about, but a more comprehensive change. Journeying forth brings about a parallel to the splitting of the sea within the soul of a person. The hidden godliness that is inside each of our souls is revealed. And this is what is represented by the splitting of the sea in the world. There is another distinction between journeying forth to Mount Sinai, and it says that the approaches of these four different camps that we have been talking about stem from our wisdom, but journeying forth, going to where God is sending us, going towards Mount Sinai, is a response to God's command. So it says the study of Torah brings down into the world as it exists, the four different realms of the four different worlds. And it says, studying to fulfill God's will draws down the Torah as it is united within the God's essence. Meaning we can reach that point. We can have a connection to the essence of God. And this is a lesson for every generation. When a Jew is introduced to a path of divine service that runs contrary to their natural tendencies, and that a person has difficulty in accepting, it is probably this with which God wants from a person. That the divine providence caused you to even hear about it. I remember when I first came from India to Israel, and I was fortunate enough to stumble across Diaspora Yeshiva and Rabbi and Rebbetzin Goldstein, who changed hundreds of people's lives and reflected back the creativity and the beauty of the Jewish soul in its full garments, and without an ability to want to crush a soul, but want that soul to soar and to take all its potential and its talents with them. So that the difficulties or the things that a person might have to rein themselves in on, the divine providence of what they were exposed to and what they had to work towards, was supported by some great teachers and people who exemplified holiness and gave us an example of how to be in this world. And it says, when a path of divine service is accepted enthusiastically and without effort, we don't know where it comes from. But when one is exposed to a path of service that is hard for a person, and a person has to work hard to achieve it, and a person has to conquer their nature to achieve it, it comes from a directive from above. And it says that we can find how to find that connection in the path that we're going on. and why it is difficult sometimes for us to accept a certain path, and how we have to find people who can support us, and great teachers and mashpiyim, and a way to affect our own personal and individual creativity and our own talent in connecting and serving God to the path that we're asked to follow. So it goes on to say, to continue in what we studied in the beginning of this class, there is a common factor in the four approaches of the four different camps, and Torah is linking them all. All four are responses. The camp that wanted to wage war, that camp that wanted to go back to slavery, that camp that wanted to pray, that they all come from the human intellect, that they all came from what the person themselves wanted to do, and not from a level of self-transcendence and commitment to the will of God. And that their service was imperfect, and they overlooked that final lesson, the lesson of journeying forth, going to the end, reaching that goal. And it says that we do have the ability to nullify ourselves or our desires in such a way to adapt to what God's will is. But it needs to be with joy. It cannot be from the place of it being a burden, or, as we said before in the lesson, of harsh labor. It has to be with that joy and vitality. We have to see the value in it and what it brings into our lives, and how it enlightens us, and how it enlivens us, and how it brings riches to our soul. And it says that when a person's conduct has this aspect of moving oneself over to do the will of God, that God will empower us to appreciate and to serve God with this divine will. And the resulting directive will be an expression of the fulfillment of the person's nature, even though it might be contrary to the nature. That we can reach our highest level by harnessing in our nature and using it in the service of God. And this is how journeying forth brings about a parallel to the splitting of the sea within a person's soul. So within the inner reaches, the deep inner reaches of a Jewish soul, there is this bitul, this self-nullification to the will of God. And it says, but our human nature and our habits and the way we behave in the world conceal this. But when a person leaves Egypt, and remember in the beginning of the lesson we said, a person has to see themselves as leaving Egypt, leaving their limitations every single day. That when a person transcends their personal limitations and their personal preferences and commits themselves to the will of God, the sea splits within their soul and their inner self is revealed. And I can only say that I do believe that is true, and I have personally found that to be true. And it was very difficult for me at a certain point of my life to give up living in India and to give up that reflection and that connection to serving in a certain manner, and to come to my full Jewish potential and understand what godliness is trying to reveal by having a Jewish soul live a Jewish life. And the revelation of godliness that's hidden within the soul of an individual brings about a revelation of the godliness hidden within the world at large, which means the splitting of the sea, which is about ultimate revelation, when the glory of God will be revealed and all flesh together will see, because we know that in the future redemption, that the flesh will see the godliness that exists in the world, that it will be it says in In the book of Bereshit, it says that Avram is told, whatever Sarah is telling you, listen to her words and listen to her voice. And Sarah represents the body, and Abraham represents the soul. And we know that in the future redemption, it's going to be the soul, the body that's going to reflect the godliness, and the soul is going to see it. So, to conclude, that we can appreciate how journeying forth brings about this parallel in a Jewish soul, because within the inner reaches of every Jewish soul, there is this bitul to God's will, this self-nullification to the will of God. But who we are conceals this. But when we leave Egypt, when we transcend our individual limitations and our personal preferences and commit ourselves to God's will, the sea splits within the soul and the inner self is revealed. And this revelation of the godliness that is hidden within the soul of a person brings about the revelation of godliness hidden within the world at large, which is the splitting of the sea. And this is the ultimate revelation. So first of all, l'chaim in my Sheva Chaya from Sfat cup. And I have to say I'm closer than further to ending up in Sfat. I don't know when that will be. Maybe in the summer. But for all my Sfat friends who are watching today, I will be there. So this teaching usually coincides with a yontiv, a Hasidic yontiv called Yud Shvat, which is the anniversary of the passing of the previous Rebbe and the day that the Rebbe became Rebbe. And it says the Rebbe's directive, the previous Rebbe's directives were to journey forth, that we should not isolate ourselves from the world, and that Torah and mitzvahs should not be seen as harsh labor, that it shouldn't be about combating negative forces, but it means that we're fulfilling our obligation with joy and simcha and vitality and trust in God. And that we need to illuminate the world with godliness and fulfill the mission with energy and with vitality, and bring the world closer to the revelation of the Torah's inner secrets. And this can be achieved through the personal splitting of the sea, revealing godliness that is hidden within one's soul. Because each of our soul's potentials are revealed by the Torah. And it says there are many of Torah's mystic secrets which reveal the hidden potentials of our souls. And we have to reveal the godliness that's hidden within the world, the splitting of the sea. And we have to reveal the godliness hidden within our souls, the splitting of the sea. And this comes from above to bring mystic secrets. And these secrets are enclosed in every aspect of the Torah. And this was accomplished through the Rebbes. And it says that there are treasures for generations that were revealed. So I want to at least complete this part of the farang, and I don't know how much further I will go on, because I did do a Zoom Tu B'Shvat Seder tonight for an hour and a half, so that is why I started the class late. But I want to, at least for now, tell a story connected to Yud Shvat, because normally the Yud Shvat, which is the Chabad Hasidic anniversary of the Rebbe becoming Rebbe and the previous Rebbe leaving this world, is a very big celebration. It's what we call an Eitzvah, an auspicious moment. And I was privileged to hear an amazing story connected to Yud Shvat, and I want to share that story right now. So, l'chaim, l'chaim. That's the end of my Tu B'Shvat Seder l'chaim. So, first I want to tell you the advice from a tree. Stand tall and proud, go out on a limb, remember your roots, drink plenty of water, be content with your natural beauty, and enjoy the view. So there are many beautiful teachings on Tu B'Shvat. I don't think I'm going to do too many of them, but let me tell you the story of Yud Shvat first. So let's see, my grandson is now 23. 10 years ago, right before his bar mitzvah, my husband received an email from a man. His name was Avrami Richter. And he said, "Hi, I'm your cousin. I just did a genealogy search and I found you, and I found also hundreds of cousins, and you were my second cousin." Now, my husband grew up his whole life thinking he had no relatives. His parents both were survivors of the Holocaust. His mother, I think, had 1 or 2 siblings out of 10 or 12 that were left after the war. His father maybe had 1 sibling that was left after the war. And my husband grew up thinking he had absolutely no family. So it was actually quite a shock when Avrami Richter got in touch with him over 10 years ago, and not only got in touch with him, but connected him to many family members. It was really quite a miracle. And nothing is by chance, by Hashgacha Pratis. Avrami Richter was also a Chabad Shliach, as my husband was, which was even more mind-blowing. And not only was he a Chabad Shliach, but he had connection to all the rest of the family. And I believe it was the last summer I was in Israel, which is 2 summers ago, he was there for a child's bar mitzvah, and he organized at my daughter Hindela's house a family gathering of about 30 people that were all family, all who lived in Israel and who all were religious, from Haredi, who came with white socks and Belzer Hasidim, to people who were living in the Shomron, holding on to the land of Israel for us. And it was just remarkable. And one of the families that were there, the Frischman family, they used to live in Westwood, California, and they used to daven in Westwood Chabad with my husband, not ever knowing that they were cousins to each other. I mean, just amazing story. So at the end of this family gathering, Mimi, we said l'chaim for your father, that he should have an Elias, a neshama, Moshe Raphael, ben Yitzhak Yosef, my dear friend Mimi's father. L'chaim on Tu B'Shvat, that his neshama should be shining down and dragging us out of exile, just schlepping us out with him. So l'chaim. I only have a drop of my l'chaim juice left. So Avrami Richter, at the end of the evening in Yerushalayim, 2 summers ago, told me the following story. Avrami is a prison chaplain, and he's only one of 4 actually paid federal chaplains in the United States. And he works at a prison, he works there 4 days a week, which is a 2-hour drive from his house. And one of the people in that prison that he was responsible for was a man named Shalom Mordechai Rubashkin, who is a Lubavitcher Chassid who was arrested, who had served a term of 8 years of a prison sentence, of a 28-year sentence, which was unheard of for the financial crime that he had committed, that other people were only serving 1 year for. And it was clearly, in that sense of the long-term sentence, extremely anti-Jewish. And what happened at the time was that every holiday and every Shabbos, Avrami Richter would give to the Jewish prisoners a small bottle of grape juice that they could say Kiddush on. And Rabbi Rubashkin at the time saved half of his little plastic bottle of Kedem grape juice because it was going to be Hanukkah. And he also wanted to be able to say a little Kiddush and L'chaim on Hanukkah. And he put the bottle of grape juice under his bed. And under his bed, next to the wall, was the heater of the room. And the grape juice became fermented in the heater. And when they did a search of the cells, because apparently they searched for drugs and alcohol, like how did they get there? Anyway, they found this bottle of fermented grape juice, and he and Shalom Mordechai Rabashkin was accused of having alcohol. Now, having alcohol, because it was fermented, having alcohol in the prison was one of the biggest crimes there was, and that if a person was found guilty, that they could be denied having a visitor for over 2 years to come visit them in prison. It was an extremely serious crime. And immediately, when the alcohol was found, when this bottle of grape juice that fermented was found, Rabbi Rabashkin was taken to solitary confinement, which is supposedly a horrible experience, and he was left there. And only because the warden was away that day and Avrami Richter, our cousin's boss, was in charge of the prison that day, that he was able to be returned to his cell and not to be in solitary confinement. But a hearing was going to be held. Now, if he was determined guilty at the hearing, the punishment would be very severe, maybe 2 years without being allowed a visitor at all at any time into the prison. But one of the things that during this hearing is that a prisoner was allowed a defender, not a lawyer, but a defender. So Avrami Richter, our cousin, said that he never would defend anybody if they needed a defender. It was just not one of the things he did. But Shalom Mordechai Rabashkin asked him if he would be his representative at this meeting, and he felt that he could not say no. So they asked him, what date do you want the meeting? And he looked at his calendar, and he thought he's going to fail. I mean, how could he ever be verbally astute enough to defend somebody when a prison is going after them for every crime and every nuance they can? And he looked at the calendar, and he saw that the holiday of Yud Shvat, which just passed last Shabbos, was coming up. And he felt, you know what? And it was in about 4 months' time, and he felt that was as good a date as any. And he said to them, I can't be available to this particular date. And he picked Yud Shvat, hoping for a miracle, hoping for the best. And they said, okay. So Yud Shvat comes, and he's at a hearing with Shalom Mordechai Rabashkin and a, quote, judge appointed by the prison, who was somebody who Avrami Richter, our cousin, knew well. And he couldn't believe that he was being so horrible in this meeting. He was just like ragging on him and not listening to the good things, and it wasn't going well. So at one point, Avrami Richter stood up, and he took out of his pocket a picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he handed it to this quote-unquote judge. And he put it in his hand, and he said, do you know who this man is? And the judge said, no. And he said, this is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He is the leader of world Jewry. And today is the day that he became Rebbe, and in 1951, he told him the year. And meanwhile, the judge is holding the picture of the Rebbe, and Avrami Richter says to him, the Rebbe wants you to expunge this case. And this judge looks at the picture, and he says, expunged. And the whole case was dropped. It was finished. And only because of this did the miracle happen that Avrami Richter was pardoned and he was allowed to leave prison 8 years after a 28-year sentence. And I always thought of this story of our relative that we never knew telling us this story, that on Yud Shvat, this miracle happened for a Jew, because if he had been charged and found guilty of having grape juice that turned into alcohol, he would never have been able to receive a pardon from President Trump, which he did, because you can have nothing on your record to receive a pardon. And it was a miracle that happened on that day. And we know that these days in our history are called Eitz Ratzon. They're times of miraculous healing, miraculous recovery, miraculous situations. And we can't give up hope that there is Eitz Ratzon every single day. And I heard a story today about Eretz Yisrael that I just want to repeat, because it's about a man called Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, who was the teacher of the Alter Rebbe. And I remember one year, my husband was very determined to find his grave. He was buried in Tiberias. Now his grave is marked, and there's a pathway, and there's a walkway, and there are benches, and there are trees. But at that time, there was nothing there. And I remember it was the hottest day of the summer. Maybe I was pregnant that day. I don't remember. And we went with Chaya Bracha Leiter and my husband were determined to find the grave of Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. And Chaya Bracha, who was a tour guide, had a book with her. And it described on how many trees over from the road, where you can find it. And it took us many hours in the heat until we found his grave. And it says about him that he came from Europe to live in Eretz Yisrael. And he tried to live in Sfat, but he couldn't sleep. And eventually he moved to Tiberias. And it says that there was a party one night in Tiberias, and a student of his asked, and he said, get everybody together, we're going to have a Farbrengen, and we're going to have a party, and we're going to just carry on. And he says, and the student says, what are we celebrating? And he tells a story that when he was a boy in Europe, people would come from Israel for money and for support, because at that time in Israel, there was no way to earn money. The only way Jews were able to survive in Israel was from help from Jews from outside the country. And he said that he was fascinated, and he said that he saw that he had a soul that was connected to the land of Israel. And he was given blessings that he should make it there in Israel. And it says that he wanted to know about the holiness of the land of Israel. And he was told that when he would be able to hear the grasses praise Israel, and the stones praise Israel, and the trees praise Israel, then he'd know about the holiness of Israel. And he said to this student, I've been here for 20 years, longing to hear the song of the land of Israel. And for the first time I heard it. And he said, when you talk about the holiness of the land of Israel, you're not talking about it in a physical sense, but that the actual rivers contain holiness, and the stones contain holiness, and the lands and the trees and the rocks and all the fruits that we celebrated tonight with Simchas Torah, that they contain the holiness of the physical land. And it says that physicality and spirituality are deeply connected. They're interlocked and they're integrated. But we see in the physical, and we need to see the sparks of holiness. So on this day of Tu B'Shvat, on this day of great simcha and great rejoicing in the land of Israel, that that we can rectify the sins that have gone on, and we can really commit ourselves to going forward, to crossing the Red Sea, to receiving the Torah. And we really want to honor and acknowledge that we are connected. And today, Tu B'Shvat, we eat the 7 different fruits of Israel. So I want to conclude with just something a little light, because I could bring all night, but I think I won't. So here's a little teaching to end Rosh Hashanah on the the Rosh Hashanah of the trees. 9 ways to be like a tree. Always grow towards the light. As we go through life, we must move towards holiness and light, reaching higher for that which is beyond us. This is really true. Go towards the light. Number 2, even the smallest scratch can have lasting effects. So it says that how careful we must be in educating ourselves and our families and our children and our friends. Grow deep roots. As we grow, we must remain connected to our source, which is God. How do we bind ourselves to God? By doing mitzvahs. The word mitzvah is connected to the word meaning attachment. When we perform a mitzvah, we're creating a bond with God who gave us the commandments. Provide the 4th level of ways to be like a tree. Provide refuge for others. Be a source of comfort for others and provide resources for those in need. Number 5, grow sweet fruits for others to enjoy. Beyond providing shade, a tree also bears fruits. Reach out to others, bring sweetness and sustenance to their lives. Even if it takes many years for the seeds you sow to come into their own. Honi Hamagal once met an elderly man planting a carob tree. "Tell me," Honi asked the old man, "how long does it take for this tree to bear fruit?" "It takes 70 years, the man answered. Surprised, Honi asked him, "Do you think you will live 70 more years to eat the fruit of the tree?" "I found carob trees in this world," the old man replied. "Just as my ancestors planted trees for me, so do I plant trees for those who follow." Number 6, let your leaves return to the earth. Just as the leaves of a tree fall to the earth to enrich the soil, we must give back to the world to sustain others. Number 7, be supple in the wind. Only a tree that can bend in the wind will survive a storm. We must be accepting of what God sends, never breaking or giving up hope. Number 8, grow stronger through your life experience. Just as the rings of a tree record its growth through years of drought and rain and fire and calm, so must we continue to grow, always adding another level of wisdom. Number 9, be impactful. Trees don't only provide immediate benefits like shade, wood, and food. They enrich the ecosystem. They filter the air and they give off oxygen. Make a lasting impact on the world. So everybody should have a beautiful Tu B'Shvat. Thank you for joining. Next week we will have class again at 8 o'clock. And for all of you who are seeing this from Eretz Israel, please enjoy Tu B'Shvat there for us who are here. And for all of us that are here, that we should really merit that in the next year we should all be together sitting under our fig trees and in our fruit orchards, that we should all be in Eretz Israel with one heart and one soul, that we can bring love and kindness and healing and beauty to the world. And I just, even though I have only a drop left in my Sheva Chaya cup, I want to wish everybody a l'chaim. Thank you so much. And good night, everyone.